So this is an event. We don't have the display yet, but this is an event which about building resilient future, especially through locally led adaptation action. I'll now request Executive Director Dr. Tom Mitchell to give some welcome remarks. But I forgot to mention that I'm Ritu Bharadwaj. I'm the Director Climate Resilience, Finance and Loss and Damage at IIED. So over to you, Tom.
Can you just give me a thumbs up to say if you can hear me okay? No? Does this work now? Perfect. All right. Sorry about that. So yes, as Ritu said, my name's Tom Mitchell. I'm the Executive Director of the International Institute for Environment and Development. Delighted to see you here today as part of this session. So as Ritu mentioned, we're looking particularly at the way in which you can have locally led approaches to tackling loss and damage and promoting adaptation. And we've got an esteemed kind of panel to work with today. But I just wanted to shed a little bit of insight onto why IIED, why we're hosting this type of event, what are the things that we do. So we've had for many years a kind of a dedicated body of work and program around loss and damage, but particularly with a focus on practical solutions, working together with communities across the global south and amplifying their voice in the way in which international and national policy is developed around loss and damage. And it was that way in which we developed, and Ritu was at the heart of this, deliberative dialogues with different communities around the world that was really at the heart of influencing some of the decisions here at COP around establishing loss and damage program, loss and damage fund, and all of the lead up that there has been to the announcement and call for proposals on Monday. And my colleagues will talk to that from the Loss and Damage Secretariat. But just to also give you a sense of an overview now of the body of work we have a program called All Act. Ritu has been leading that program. All Act is essentially a global network of organizations pushing for locally led transformative approaches to addressing loss and damage. And just to give you an insight, that program includes a number of different elements, program elements that come together to create the overall strategic impact. And so there's a number of elements. One is that we work very closely with building the capacity of local researchers across least developed countries and small island developing states. And we've launched a scholarship program in the name of Salim al-Haq, the Salim al-Haq Scholarship Program. And for those of you who know Salim, he was an absolute stalwart of the COPs, of bringing local voices into COPs, and sadly passed away 3 years ago. But we've launched the scholarship in his name, and the first group of scholars are coming through, and some of them are now part of the IPCC. So we're delighted to have that type of mentorship that has brought them on. And so really good element of the program. A second element, and probably one of the key focuses, is how we strengthen access to resources to tackle loss and damage at the local level, particularly through changing the way social protection mechanisms work. So we think, based on our research, that the cost-benefit analysis of using social protection mechanisms and enhancing them to tackle loss and damage is one of the most effective large-scale ways. And we have a program called Aspire. It's doing research already in 8 countries about how practically you can use those social protection systems to address loss and damage. In addition to that, we have a loss and damage observatory, which is collecting together case examples and success stories from around the world. You can access that and see the evidence coming to play. And many other aspects, including work with small island developing states on connecting debt relief with loss and damage, something called the Debt Sustainability Support Service. But rather than necessarily go through all of those elements, what I want to do is just give you a flavor of the fact that this is a really key part of IIED's work, and it allows us also to connect it to wider work across our institute on locally led adaptation, on nature finance, on working with migration in particular and forced displacement, and how to work, for example, on city hosting and migration helplines and so on. We believe an integrated package of programming of solutions is needed, and it needs to start with the practical solutions that work with the communities that matter. And that's what we're here to do, and we'd love to hear from the panel. And thank you so much for your partnership. Many of you work very closely with us already, and really key to being able to make this a success. Ritu, back to you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for providing that overview about the All Act initiative. All Act initiative, I'll just add a couple of more points to that. We now have about 50 governments which are partner. We are working in close to 35 countries, and as Tom said, our whole approach is to work with the government and not around the government. We don't want to create new parallel systems, and we are currently supporting close to 60 odd local grassroots organization, local think tank, because when we started about 3-4 years back, we found that there were not enough evidence which was really coming from the local level, especially around in terms of the realities of loss and damage. How is community really facing it? That was a data which was missing. We also did not know what kind of action and support they really want, not what global north institutions think they would typically want, and then how to finance it and how to deliver it. So these were the 4 deliberative dialogues that Tom talked about. And we are very happy that based on all of that insight that we generated from these grassroots organizations, we co-designed this All Act initiative. And as Tom mentioned, a lot of people around here, especially in this panel, have supported and are continuing to support us. We have been with us from IDRC, who's been supporting us. We have Emiliano from Brazil, and we have Ambassador Relator from Antigua and Barbuda, and we have Scottish government who's been very, very supportive of IIED's core work, which has enabled us to do that, all that deliberative dialogue, because without that core support, we would be waiting for some support to come from somewhere, because we did that at a time when loss and damage was a very sticky issue. No funder typically gave us any money, and that core support allowed us to do some of that base work. And we are now looking for new partnership with the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and we hope that all that evidence which is really coming up from the grassroots level really influences the development of proposal that comes to FRLD, and really on the basis of what's happening on the ground and what solutions have been co-developed with the community and the grassroots organization. But before we start, I do have to turn to Suchismita, Dr. Suchismita Mukhopadhyay, who's the lead specialist for advocacy at Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. As you can see here, they have a membership of about 51 countries, and more than 10 organizations are partnered with them. And we do work very closely with CDRI, especially because the focus is on building disaster resilient infrastructure. And they do provide technical assistance support, something that we really see as integral to all the work we do. We don't want to only provide reactive support through cash transfer and food aid. We do want to create resilient infrastructure that enables the communities and the governments to deal with and not be exposed to that impact of recurring disasters again and again. So over to you, Suchismita, especially to understand from you what the DRI agenda really is and how it can support the efforts around loss and damage.
Thanks, Ritu. Thank you very much. So, as Ritu mentioned, I will be talking about resilient infrastructure. We think about infrastructure only when it fails, mostly when it's in the news, when the road is inundated, when the airport is non-functional, when there's a power blackout. That's when we start thinking about infrastructure, and that's when we actually get to connecting it with how important it is really to lives, livelihoods, to your business continuity, the services, practically everything. So our job at CDRI is basically to advocate for the importance of integrating resilience considerations into your planning processes, whether at the national level, at the urban planning level, at every level. We need to now start thinking of integrating these considerations. What CDRI does is to work with our member countries and beyond to provide the technical assistance, to provide the know-how, to generate the evidence, to understand why there is a resilience dividend, why it might seem like a cost today, but in the long term, investing in resilience right at the beginning really saves your costs at the stage where there is recovery and reconstruction. So basically create the infrastructure that can bounce back quickly, it can adapt and get back the services as quickly as possible. And our research does show that there can be up to 7 to 12% of return, 12 times returns if you're investing today to be able to get returns later on. The other thing was also to understand that infrastructure resilience is really central to a lot of different issues, whether it is climate mitigation, whether it is climate adaptation, even the SDGs. It is not just about SDG 9, which is infrastructure and innovation, but it is connected to practically all the other SDGs, whether climate action, health, poverty, partnerships, everything. So we also try to bring home the point that it is important to look at infrastructure as being central to the entire discourse around climate change, discourse around environmental sustainability, and of course around disaster risk reduction. And we work at the interface of this. I will not take much long, but I do want to leave you with a few statistics and a few numbers just to get the conversation started and to bring home the point that how resilient infrastructure is really important to also the loss and damage discussion, which is directly impacting the communities. It may not seem like easily, but that's how it is. So some of our studies are saying that USD 700 to 800 billion worth of infrastructure assets are currently exposed to disasters, including climate impacts. 14% of the global GDP growth each year is at risk, 80% of which is concentrated in the critical infrastructure sectors, which is power, telecom, social infrastructure like health, education, all of that. Over 1.6 million annual service disruptions, including in health, education, etc., are caused by disasters, largely due to fragile infrastructure systems. So if we actually take into impact the direct impacts, it comes out to much more, and which definitely means that the investments in resilience today are going to avoid locking in the risks tomorrow, because infrastructure investments are long-term investments. If you're not investing right today, you're basically locking in the risks and you're leading to more damages. So I'll end there and not take this further, and I'll hand it back to Ritu.
Thank you, Sushmita. We actually published a paper day before yesterday, which was all about how do we really bring risk analytics into the way resilience is basically looked at. Because the moment you look at resilient infrastructure, you start looking at it as a cost. For government, it's a cost because you have other competing priorities. For private sector, the moment you talk about resilient infrastructure, it's something which is a social investment. It's an impact investment area. It's not a proactive business earning or something with a return. And even for MDB, investing in resilience, especially in areas which are at risk, it probably they are wary because they think it might impact their credit rating or credit standing. And what we want to transform or change in that context is resilient infrastructure is not a cost, it's an investment. And it especially becomes important. And there are two types of resilient infrastructure we are looking at. Is one which are the existing buildings, bridges, dam, or any regular infrastructure that we have, whether it's in power sector, whether it's in education, health, in all of these spaces. And the other infrastructure which is about creating seawalls, creating flood embankment and so on. And what we found was that 50% of global infrastructure is yet to be built, and 80% of infrastructure needed in Africa is yet to be built, which means that if we are going in a climate blind manner, then we are at risk of investing in infrastructure which may not stand the test of tomorrow's disaster, and especially because disasters have increased close to 5 times. We also did a research which Tom alluded to earlier, which is ASPIRE. So it's Anticipatory Social Protection Index for Resilience, where we looked at the data of 8 countries and 24 social protection programs. And it was based on absolute grassroots level information. In fact, Emiliano is working on doing a similar initiative now in Brazil, and we are shortly going to start it in Antigua and Barbuda, and then we're going to scale it up in other contexts. But what's the information that we've come out based on our analysis is that in those 8 countries, based on the previous 62 years disaster data, these countries would suffer a loss and damage of around $21 billion. And if they were to address those loss and damage using the existing programs, they'll end up spending $98 billion to cover the $21 billion of loss. But if early anticipatory response is provided, then the same 21 billion loss can be covered with 10 billion. But if resilience investment is done, early resilience investment, then the same loss can be covered with 4 billion. So I wanted to give you a bit of this context. That's why early resilience matters and what is at stake if you don't do it now. And we have there is a lot of evidence out there which shows that resilience can be an investment. It's not always a cost. So I'm going to start off by our first panelist, and I've slightly modified the way in which we are going, but probably we are going to follow the same order. I'm first going to turn to Her Excellency Roleta Thomas, who's the Climate Ambassador of Government of Antigua and Barbuda. And who would know it better than Antigua Barbuda, a small island state which is battered by one cyclone after another, and with every cyclone, every disaster event, 50, 60, 70% of the GDP gets wiped out. So it will be good to understand from you later why you consider building resilience, and especially locally led resilience measure, is important to addressing some of that loss and damage that countries like yours face.
Thank you very much, Ritu, and good morning to my fellow panelists. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda. I was born and raised in a protected area, and my background is in natural resources management. I'm giving you some background because I want you to understand where I'm coming from in what I'm talking about. Very quickly, I realized that nature does not need us. It just needs us to leave it alone. With respect to resilience and investing in resilience, culturally, in Antigua and Barbuda, we depended on nature to provide resilience, but we also invested in our own infrastructure resilience, in where we chose to live, our access to resources. So our economic activity was access to those resources, and we built in a way that allowed us to be resilient to the types of impacts we were facing at that time. So it's not that we didn't face impacts, but we built in a manner that was resilient. What has been happening now is that the impacts are so frequent that we are not able to sustain the investment in resilience. And what the actions that we used to take, that used to be able to cover that resilience, that measure of investment in resilience, that doesn't work anymore. So that issue of us understanding that we need to invest in resilience is not an issue that we don't understand. We understand it very, very well. And if you look culturally at how we used to practice our traditional lifestyles and activities, you could see that we had resilience. The issue is now we do not have the quantum of financing ourselves to continue to invest in the resilience and to maintain that resilience. So that's the first point. So I don't want anybody to get the impression that we don't know how to plan, we don't know how to behave. This is why locally led interventions are very, very important. We do not have a university collecting data. So we do not have lots and lots of evidence and analytics to show you what we're talking about. But we do have an elderly man who sits on the corner who is able to tell you you cannot put the desal pipe there because he has seen in his lifetime waves and he would not put it there. That is very hard to quantify to an external engineer who is coming in with a model, who we're telling them that model, because you ran it on the other side of the island, it will not work for this side because we have a reef here. These are the types of details that you need in a scaled down situation that will impact whether we can be sustainable as a society or not, whether we can continue to live in this space or not. This is why for us, we need to drive the solutions, and our local knowledge and expertise needs to be respected at the same level of somebody with a PhD when we are designing solutions. Very, very important. The other notion that I want to dispel is that working in islands will take a lot of investment in time. It's not as simple as taking a database and slapping onto everybody. We are very, very different. And the cultural acceptance of some resilience measures, because we know what worked for us and we have invested in that in the past, is critically important. Also important in the structure and fabric of our society is the societal resilience and the relationships between community support systems, which also has to be worked into that loss and damage scenario. At this COP, I am reflecting on Jamaica and Melissa. And for you to understand that there are over 22 communities that have not been accessed in Jamaica so far because one road that led to that community is cut off. So the death tolls that you're seeing now are grossly underestimated. There are people who have lived in these places for hundreds of years, that for this storm is the first time in anybody's living lifetime that the measures that they would have taken traditionally to be resilient are not working. They're not working. There are some cases that we will have to project into the future to forecast what resilience measures make. So I would encourage all of these donors who are looking at projects to know that we may not have hindsight. We may not have the evidence to show, but we can project into the future based on what has happened in other areas. I just wanted to go into what we are doing in Antigua and Barbuda already. We recognize that from a government perspective that we need to invest in resilience. We just cannot now with the limited fiscal space that we have. And so under the AVAS, there's the DSS that we're supporting. However, that has to be integrated. All of these measures that we're taking have to be integrated with our local context and understanding that we are building today, not for today. We're building today for 50 years from now, because if you do not allow us that 50 years to recover and move from just survival to prosperity, we'll never get out of this disastrous loop that we're in.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and very well said. Who else can capture that thought better than you? And one point that you really was really important there was, with every 24-hour passing after a disaster, the casualty keeps going up, and that's why we need to invest in resilient infrastructure, and that's why the climate fund need to prioritize some of that, not as a cost but as an investment, something with a return. So I'm now going to turn to another government which has prioritized loss and damage at a time when no other government talked about loss and damage. Scottish government was the first to come up with an exclusive loss and damage fund, and more than that, that fund supported grassroots organization, enabled people to try out new practical, what Tom was mentioning, practical solutions for loss and damage. It'll be great to hear from you, Gillian, as to what are some of those measures, like some of the efforts that you have done, and what are some of the early learnings from that effort?
I'm happy to talk about our Climate Justice Fund, and I think that's one of the reasons why I find it so important that Scotland is represented in places like COP, and we go all over the world talking about this, because we're not a state, we're a country, but we're a subnational government, and I've been talking throughout this whole COP about the climate action that subnational governments have been able to take, but also it's our responsibility, and it's open to us to have climate justice actions as well, and I think sometimes that's left too much to the states. So we're hopeful that with the learnings that we've got about our Climate Justice Fund and our Loss and Damage Fund, which was announced at the COP that we hosted in Glasgow, that we not only can evidence how it's worked and the things that it's actually done for communities who've suffered great loss and damage as a result of climate change implications, but we can also say you don't have to wait for states to do it, you can do it at subnational government level, and we obviously are involved in quite a lot of fora, like Under 2 Coalition and Regions 4 Coalition, talking to other subnational governments as well. So if I can just share you asked for some, how it's worked and the evidence, and I think that's one of the things that Scotland can bring. We've now got an evidence of a loss and damage fund that's not just been a pledge, it's actually been delivered on the ground, it's actually worked as well. We were very clear, though, that we wanted to send a strong signal that loss and damage should be additional funding for finance for mitigation and adaptation. They are very different things. And adaptation in particular, after what we've just heard from my colleague here, adaptation in providing resilience cannot be eaten into by loss and damage. They're two separate things that we need to address. Of course, the Global South has been campaigning for decades in this, and we were very proud to be the first to announce it. We've been testing different approaches to distributing climate justice funding to find out what works, what communities need. We've been very, very clear that we need to actually have the asks of communities from the get-go. You know, again, we just had a demonstration of how important. If you don't do that, you're wasting your money, frankly. You know, you're wasting your time and you're wasting your money. Aside from all the other implications of how patronising and condescending that is, it's very important. If your money is going to work hard for you, it's going to work hard, it's going to actually have results. It needs to be, the community has to tell you what it is that they need. So in Malawi, female farmers used our support to combine indigenous practices with new approaches like winter cropping, and that meant that the families had an extra season of income and food security as a result of that. That's what they asked for. We facilitated that with funding in Zambia. People with disabilities came together for their priorities. They wanted new schools, water boreholes, food access points. They wanted to reinforce their houses with stronger materials so that they could withstand future shocks and they could maybe not have to build back again and again and again. In Rwanda, they were very keen that everyone was involved in the meetings that were making decisions about how loss and damage funding was used, and they pointed to the fact that many people who had mobility issues or had sensory loss, they could not take part in meetings, so they were displaced and they were excluded and had no agency. So their programme wanted to make sure that everyone in their community were able to join in the meetings, so it made the decisions as well. And in Rwanda, disabled people and the elderly were paid to complete 600 hectares of terracing and planting over 370 trees. That not only provided employment to people that had, no access to income, but it also meant that they were able to basically build back a farming and agricultural system that could stand flooding and soil erosion for decades to come. On our last loss and damage fund, we had a cash transfer programme. Cash transfers, as mentioned. Governments are very nervous of giving cash directly straight to people. We've proved that it actually works. Trust people. They're not going to run away with your money and go crazy and do something crazy with it. They're actually going to use the money for things that is going to improve the lives of themselves, their family and their community. People bought livestock, people started businesses. They weren't really asked to account for the fact, they wanted to build this particular business. I saw a great example of a guy who said he bought a DVD player and a widescreen television because he was starting up a cinema business. He was able to go around, areas and show football, so people were entertained and people paid him to do this. This is something that, I think people go, what, he bought a television? No, he started a business, a very resilient business as well. More children attended school, livestock ownership soared. Malawi had localised early warning systems, such as community weather stations to monitor rainfall, soil temperature and wind speed as well, so that they could take action when they were able to have those early warnings to protect what they had. And disaster risk management plans were also revised to make them inclusive of the needs of the elderly and disabled people. This wasn't top down. This came from them saying, okay, give us the money to do this, and also give us the money to do lots of different things that you might think, why, what? But they worked, and we were able to get people had notification on phones. The cash is now with you. Go, build, do, create, do what you need to with this money. And we've done a study and we've got analysis of what's worked. So it's been published, I think, just here. I'm just looking at my officials. So we were able to say to other sub-national governments and indeed national governments who don't have loss and damage programs, have a look at our evidence. These were the programs that took part. these were the resilience that was built as a result of loss and damage, where people were able to not just build back, but build back in a more resilient way. They were able to protect themselves against the shocks of weather or the economic shocks, but also the trauma that they had experienced as a result of devastation after devastation after devastation. And it didn't come from us. We just facilitated it by giving money and trusting people on the ground. And everyone was involved in those decisions.
Thank you. And one can see the passion as you're speaking, because you have really invested in that, in creating that resilience, and you've witnessed what it has led to, and especially the fact that providing timely cash, timely money, and timely support, what that can lead to. So, as you were speaking, I could hear two types of intervention. One is providing early cash, just before or after disaster strikes, and you also invested in early warning system, but also building longer term resilience. So you can't just pick one and not do the other. So we need to work on both providing immediate support after a disaster strikes and also investing in longer term resilience. So as you say, they can build back more resilient. And there are a lot of really good learnings that other funders can learn, but also we have a new FRLD announcement that has come out. So, but before I go on to GA, I'll probably turn to Annika, who's the Deputy Director General in Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. You've heard what a country government wants. You've heard what a subnational government with a very small, I would say, pot of money, the kind of transformational impact that it has created. Would want to understand from you, hearing all of this, but I know CEDA has already been in this space for a very long time, supporting grassroots organizations, supporting LLA, and so on. What is your donor priority, especially in terms of building locally led resilience and adaptation, and something that helps people deal with loss and damage?
Thank you, and very interesting to listen to some of the partner perspectives, partner country perspectives. I think that what Sweden is trying to do together with our partners at the local level, the national level and the global level is of course to base our support on what people are asking for at the local level. But how do you do that? How do you know that the people that you speak to are the ones that are presenting the ideas that the village or the community is interested in? So I think we start at the village level, we go up to perhaps the county level, the regional level, the national level, including ensuring that we include women, men, the elder, young people in the discussion, and then basing the dialogue on what the needs are in that specific situation, but also what the risk assessment is from that specific community. And I think it was very interesting to hear that most knowledge is already there. So, but what we can do is to add, of course, knowledge from other parts of the world. There is so much experience. We can also add financial mechanisms which can bring on board new technology or innovations, but always adapted to that specific local situation. We can ensure that other global entities or other governments are, become more interested in supporting with financial structures those specific community needs. We can also ensure that civil society is thriving across, for example, a country or a region, to make sure that also the grassroots organizations are part of the discussion, to try to increase the amount of people that can actually be part of the transition and the solutions. But we also know that without the social protection system, without the child protection system, without the disaster risk management system, which is also linking the community level to the national protection system, it will be ever so hard for people at the local level to not only survive, but also to develop their community. So I think Sweden is trying to, through its development cooperation, to on one hand ensure that people can take part that people are listened to. On the other hand, that the technology that might be good in many cases to use is used and is accessible at a cost which is affordable, but also to link the local and the national level to other actors across the world who can provide other solutions and also ensure that perhaps the private sector's assessment of investment is that where the risks are decreased, so that at least the perception of risk will be handled, and that people at the local level also can access credit. Because I think that, as all of us know, that people with resources, people with education, people with a voice, they will find solutions at the local level. So I think this is true for agriculture or energy or for infrastructure, all of it. So that's where Sweden is trying to increase its support. And I think we have a lot of very good examples. And I just mentioned very shortly one example from Kenya, where I used to be working until this year, which is the FLOCA program, which is the locally led climate adaptation program, where Sweden, together with the World Bank and FCDO and others, have supported an integrated system across the country where communities and counties are basically explaining their priorities and their needs, and then we're trying to match the financing of those needs across all different sectors, but to combat climate change and to create sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I feel really proud that IID was part of that FLOCA initiative, and one of my colleagues, Flo, I think she was Flo and said was very engaged with that. But what really struck from what you mentioned was that we need to invest in a whole of a systems approach. We need to invest in technology, we need to invest in capacity, research, and all of that. And one thing based on my experience of, is it just me or? Okay. So one thing which we have really learned from our All Act initiative in the last 2-3 years is we do mention some of the innovative aspects of climate resilience, adaptation measures being done here and there. And I was struck by what Relator mentioned, that there is so much which is already happening on the ground, and we don't know because they're not documented. They never reach these platforms at international level or even at the national level. A lot of people don't know. So as part of that effort, what we did was we wanted to create a platform where the grassroots organizations, whatever initiative they are doing, they're able to capture that, well, carry out economic assessment of both economic as well as non-economic loss and damage, and publish it on a place somewhere. Because we talk to so many, not the local universities still get an avenue by which they publish, but you look at local think tanks, grassroots organizations, they have no platform, and they say, oh, we have such a good case study, we have done this. So one effort that we are doing is to create this loss and damage research observatory, where we are trying to collate all of that evidence together, so that evidence then influences the development of proposals, like something that goes to FRLD or to GCF or to donors like CEDA or Scottish Government and others. And we are thankful, and I'm now going to turn to Bhim, IDRC, because IDRC has a long history of supporting evidence and research generation. So when we reached out to IDRC saying that we want to create a platform where this can happen, we are very happy that IDRC came forward to support it. And now we are supporting organizations, as Tom was mentioning, in 35 countries. Some of them are being supported through the Salimul Haq scholarship, but a lot of them are being supported through other partner support. And we are very happy that a lot of that evidence is now getting utilized for designing innovative financing mechanism, for developing. We have already started developing proposal for loss and damage fund, hoping, we were already anticipating an announcement would be done for Senegal, for Antigua, Barbuda and other governments. So we would turn to you because, see, Relator really explain what a small island state or even a least developed country faces. They are facing a lot, but they're not able to show evidence about that. So how is IDRC, of course you are supporting us, but generally how is IDRC really helping generate a lot of that locally led? We keep talking about locally led adaptation and we keep saying locally led research. So how is IDRC supporting that locally led research and providing a platform where they could influence national as well as international policy discourse?
Thanks, Ritu. So, as you rightly pointed out, IDRC is a research funding organization based in Canada. So, if you look at our entire research portfolio, 90% of our research work pretty much in the local, because we work with local policy think tanks, local government, university, and research institution. So this is a kind of our DNA. I was so glad to hear Ambassador, like when you say the local knowledge is already there, but we hadn't really able to use that knowledge at the required level. How this knowledge can make a business case for investment in many of these areas. So right now we have two kind of loss and damage related project. One Ritu already mentioned. This is looking more on the economic and non-economic loss and damage. And the first one we started back in 2023 with Salibul Haq, when he was still with us. It was, the more emphasis was on some of the knowledge I think you mentioned. We really need to document the knowledge, what is available there. And how we can synthesize that knowledge in a way that, that is going to help the policymakers. So we have like a 3 case study just completed. One is from Bangladesh, where we're looking what this loss and damage cost looks like in this particular 4 areas of the coastal village. So one thing we came to know that there is already an adaptation limit. I think we need to talk that. It's little academic, but there is nothing to adapt right now because we have already reached the both hard and soft adaptation limit. Because there was a village in Nepal, for example, the entire village was washed out by the flooding in 2023. So there's nothing you cannot mitigate. There's nothing to mitigate, adapt as well. So I think this is one of the very strong kind of point that came out from that case study. And like Bangladesh, you look at all this coastal erosion, salt water intrusion, and there's a whole bunch of non-economic issues as well. Like one case study was finding that there's a huge amount of skin disease of the girl child, and they're getting darker. And it's very difficult to get married, because in South Asia, if you're darker, it's very hard to find the partner who will like to marry you. So you have a whole bunch of this very, very local, very typical issue. We haven't been able to tell that story the entire world. So that was one very striking example to me. And second, if you look at the whole entire Bangladesh, they are already investing about $3 billion for the loss and damage kind of related work, which is already putting a lot of pressure on this domestic finance because, obviously there is a whole bunch of debt issue. So the one example I was just particularly looking at if you want to resettle like one household climate refugee, it costs about like $7,000 US. So just like settling one household, like to separate place, you're talking about $7,000. So if you talk about entire village, I think that we're talking about huge amount of money here. So that's some insight I think we gain. What is the magnitude of finance we're talking about? What is required at the local level to address the challenges? That's the one. And second, same case in the Vanuatu, because we work in the very small island kind of area. It's called Imau Island, where I think the whole entire village was wiped away back in 2023 by a huge cyclone. And then, obviously they have to resettle these people. And there is a small village within this island. So, in order to resettle this village to other place, they're estimating almost I think it was $10,000 like one house up to resettle to other place. So again, I think because what we've seen that this kind of knowledge is very, very important for us to highlight and really synthesizing that knowledge so that I think policymakers can act with. We have same case from Nepal, like back in 2020, there was huge flooding, and that washed our entire, one big village, and the loss was around like $52 million, which is really huge for the small country like Nepal. It's a very agriculture-based economy. there is not much going on in terms of like a job, employment kind of thing. And the government was planning giving like $5,000 per his household, but finally I think they ended up getting $300 per household. You know, if you look at the loss, around like a $10,000 loss for his household. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you look at all the what is happening at the local level, again the the magnitude of finance required. So this is not there. So what we're trying to do here, we're really trying to collect that knowledge, and in a way that it makes a sense to policymakers, because we need to invest. It's not only about public finance; it's about private finance as well. How we can make a business case. So it's about collecting new data. We need more data actually to justify that. And there is also issue of attribution. Yesterday I was in a session. How you really go about justifying loss and damage finance, because there is a disaster angle of it. There is a slow onset, and you have like a rapid onset as well. So it's about data, it's about attribution, it is about new knowledge, and also capacity as well, because we really need to build this capacity at the local level. How you bring those kind of knowledge, at the required level. So that's what I think we have been doing, really funding the research, building the capacity, promoting the South-South collaboration, and developing different kind of network. We are supporting so different kind of network. So it's really being kind of building the capacity of next generation of the professional researchers, so that they can really fight, they can really come to this kind of forum and make their business case. So that's overall what we do. So most of our work, 90% of our work in developing country, like mostly focused on the local kind of areas. So we don't do anything in Canada. So that's what I think IDRC is about, and we are there almost like 25 years. We funded like more than 30,000 maybe research activities around the world, all 3 continents. Always, from the very local kind of perspective, which is going to be, I think, the key for us, because we need to build that capacity. And whatever we do, I think all these more like if you look at all the country kind of driven kind of policy, how local knowledge, can really drive that kind of process, how we can make it demand driven. So that's what I think our work has been. Capacity building, South-South collaboration, new knowledge, case study, data, attribution. That's what I think we have been doing last 20 years. And I hope, this is going to really help. It's a new debate. Because loss and damage, if you look at all the academic literature, it's pretty global right now. So I think we're really talking about, how local knowledge can be mobilized. So we really know, what is going to the country level, how country can prepare themselves if there is a huge fund coming from the, FRLD, for example. So how countries should be going about it, how we should be governing that fund. So that is the issue we are working on. Thanks, Rita.
Thank you, Beam. And I'm now going to turn to GA from FRLD, and I know you, everyone keeps looking at you, because obviously loss and damage has remained an underfunded area. It was always a controversial area. I think the very first fund came from Scottish government proper, and then some philanthropies put in some money, which enabled organizations like us to do some work. We know that loss and damage is not very simple to address. It's from slow onset, from rapid onset, things which has been completely annihilated. We have different impact on different communities in the same area. Women impacted differently compared to elderly and youth and so on. But we are also happy that there is an announcement of 250 million. It's not ideal. The amount is too less compared to the loss and damage that countries are suffering. But we heard from Scottish government, like a small amount of funding came with so much impact on the ground, and also generated so much of learning. We, like what Beam was saying, we've been working with almost 50 countries now. They are doing a lot of work, and a lot of different models are being generated. What we would want to understand from you is, there's a call out there. We are also happy that 50% of that is reserved for LDCs and SIDS, which at least gives them a fighting chance to get some money from there. How are you really going to ensure that some of those, because it's not going to be the same solution coming from every country, it's going to be different. How are you going to really test, because obviously the number of proposals will be much more than the fund that you have. So how are you going to really, I'm not asking you to give us the evaluation criteria, but one, it'll be good to understand from you what some of those priorities would be for you when you would be assessing those funds, those proposals for funding.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you as well to my fellow panelists as well as Ambassador, who also sits on our board. I think it's important, first of all, to acknowledge that the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage is here today because of all of you, because of the countries and communities and civil society that fought for many, many years for this fund to exist. So I stand on the shoulders of giants, and the rest of the Secretariat Executive Director, by no means do we think this is our own feat. The launch yesterday is an enormous progress that has shown that the fund is ready to deliver in the absence of having everything figured out. We are ready to support countries, but it is a celebration, I think, that goes beyond just FRLD as a fund. It is everybody that has been involved in this space that has contributed to us being able to launch. So I really wanted to start with that to say, we may be the face of this fund, but by no means are we the only ones that are engaged and care. Now with that said, the launch that we did yesterday was a very monumental moment, I feel, for the fund, but also for those that have been negotiating and advocating and fighting for this fund to be in existence. And in my experience, and I've worked across the various multilateral climate funds that we very frequently talk about, and I won't talk too much about them. But what I see the FRLD being is a very unique financial mechanism. And I'll first start to say it is the only one and single dedicated UNFCCC financial mechanism that is dedicated to supporting response to loss and damage. This is important because this fund was established with a different mandate, different intentions, and therefore its objective and its approach should be different. Now, one of the unique factors of this fund is, first of all, at the heart of the FRLD is the principle of bottom-up, country-led and country-owned approaches. And what this means in reality is actually something that's a very powerful message that starts from a place where we actually are stating that who are we to say we know what is needed on the ground? Who are we to dictate what is the structure of, what is the definition of how loss and damage should be responded to or addressed is actually not for us to determine or for us to dictate. So that wording of bottom-up, country-owned and country-led is something that we hold very close to every single policy, to every framework, to any modality that is proposed to the board for adoption. Now, I think, turning back to your question of, how will you prioritize, how will you assess, I actually believe, and just to introduce myself, I'm sorry, I should have started with introduction, but so I am the program manager for programming and country engagement, so I head the team that will be reviewing funding requests that are to be submitted to this fund. And of course, I hold the burden, I hold the pressure of everybody, looking at me, expecting some kind of answer or a direction of what will be approved as the first funding. And I think, for me, what I continuously tell my team, and the team that hopefully will grow bigger soon, is I'm not sure if we are the ones that should be determining the priorities. And I say that from a place of not trying to lose responsibility, but more I really feel the intention of the BIM is not for us to set a priority. It's for us to learn from the demand from countries. It's to learn from what countries are sharing to the FRLD. This is what we see as a priority need. This is what we define as loss and damage in our country context. This is what we have seen and heard and feel, and therefore please help us. And I think that intention is what I want to bring into any reviewer that is reviewing a request. We are not looking for the best written English essay or PhD thesis paper. That should by no means be any any element of assessing a proposal. We are not looking for the most robust technical, intellectual, or academic justification for how and why this fund should support. I think the board has made it clear in the establishment of the funding criteria that we are looking for three funding criteria. The first is country-led and country-owned approaches. Is this led and driven by the country? Does it show bottom-up processes, which includes communities and locally led driven approaches? Secondly, what are the results and impacts? Is it loss and damage? Or are we talking about disaster? Are we talking about humanitarian response? Are we talking about mitigation? So it's a very broad and straightforward criteria. The third is complementarity and coherence at the national level. So is this duplicating existing efforts? Is this financing a gap? And are there possibilities of looking at using the $5 to $20 million that a request could request for? Is it able to leverage other sources of funding so that it can be a bigger scale of impact through what FRLD is providing? So those are the three big areas, and I think, from the way that I look at it, and when these requests come in, I think a reality check that I've often told to the colleagues that I speak to is the first phase of this fund is only $250 million. The range of requests can come from $5 million requests all the way to $20 million requests. So if you do the math, it's actually not a massive number of proposals that could be approved in this first phase. So then, yes, the question could be, so then are you going to prioritize sectors or themes or countries? But for me, I think the bigger question is, well, when we receive all these funding requests and we test the demand, then is that not a case to say, therefore this $250 million is never going to be enough? Therefore, this fund needs to resource mobilize. Therefore, contributors, donors, philanthropies, all the actors in this space, here you go, here is the evidence of why this fund needs to be bigger, why it needs to have more resources, and why we need to support countries in a different way beyond just $5 to $20 million, which will never solve the actual real core problem. So I think that's kind of where we're looking at. Of course, the board has tasked us to develop an assessment methodology, additional guidance for countries. So currently in our website, you will see the terms of reference for the call. You will see the template. There's some general instructions there on how to fill the template, but we will be developing an assessment methodology as well detailed guidance based on what are we looking at and therefore what should countries provide in their templates. Now, what I will say is a second unique factor of this fund is its very strong focus on direct access. And direct access has been tested and piloted actually in the Adaptation Fund, who was the pioneer, as well as the GCF Fund. And in those funds, they have defined it in a certain way, they have tested it in certain ways. And I think for FRLD, one of the most interesting factors that FRLD has defined direct access is actually direct access via direct budget support via national governments. So it's even looking beyond just national development banks or regional development banks or regional. It's really looking at how can you support a national government directly through budget support through this fund. And there is no other multilateral climate fund that is testing this instrument. So I think the interest and the unique factor of what FRLD brings comes from what I was talking about is the reason for why FRLD existed in the first place. The principle of country-owned and country-led has to remain in the heart. And the bottom-up phrasing, which a lot of people, I think, perhaps skip or they kind of leave it out, but that bottom-up is actually what we put forth as the locally led, community-driven aspects to make sure that it's included in country-led and country-owned approaches. Now, I love to tell a story, and I will try to keep it short because I know there'll be questions from the floor, but I like to tell a story because I think it helps to demonstrate my own personal thinking as I work in this space, but also an intention that I feel is really at the core of what the BIM is trying to convey. And I remember being in a very, very remote part of an island in Fiji. And I was doing some study, and I come from climate change adaptation, that's my technical background. And I was doing some studies with indigenous communities, and I was jumping from one community to the next, super tired, wanting to get some information results so I could write something, in my research. And I remember I was invited to stay at somebody's place, and there were no motels, hotels, none of that sort. And there was a grandmother of a family that was living there, and I remember having a conversation with her and with her, with a translator. And I asked her a question, and I said, there's devastation in your town. I could see after this hurricane, there's loss of lives, loss of livelihood, loss of homes. You've lost your church, you've lost your schools. Doesn't that make you depressed? Right? Is there a feeling of sadness? Is there a feeling of depression? Is there a feeling of deep loss that you might never recover from? And the second question I asked her, and I'll get to you very quickly on what her response was. And the second question was, do you therefore feel the need for resilience, the need for adaptation, so that this doesn't happen again to your community? And what really shocked me was the first thing she said to me was, I'm not depressed, I'm not sad, I am very happy. And that shocked me. And the second thing she said was, and I'm very blessed. I'm blessed to be alive. I'm blessed to have the ability to recover, and I know I will recover. The disasters that happen to us, I believe God has a reason that they are happening. And what do you mean by adapting? This is the way we live. And so she conveyed to me the stories of how this was not just one incident. I was seeing one incident that happened. For this was a lifetime of disasters, of climate events, and things that they don't call climate change. They don't call it adaptation. They don't call it resilience. But that has been what they have been living throughout their whole lives and through generations. And I remember that distinct shock of realizing perhaps I was wrong in thinking when I'm going to approach this community that's been devastated by a climate event, perhaps there will be some feeling of devastation emotion. Of course there is. But the ability to recover actually was not from an intellectual standpoint of, I will come and give you support and therefore let's recover together. It was, no, we will recover no matter. No matter what happens, we will recover. We have recovered and we are still resilient today. So when we talk about the money, the financing that needs to reach those that are most vulnerable, it is not in a way of we need to show them how to be resilient. We need to show what adaptation is. We need to build resilience, because that to me sounds you already know how it needs to look like, and therefore you want to see that, which was what my research had been doing. But it's really looking at actually, if they have the resources, if they have the financing, reach them, they will figure it out. The communities know best how to be resilient because they've been resilient for their whole lifetime. All they need is that financial support. So that element of making sure the finance reaches the ground should be just the form of the support reaching. But where we need the information and where we need the requests to come to us is, therefore, how do you then build a resilience as a community? What does loss and damage really mean? And responding to loss and damage is a vague term. How will you respond in your own way, in your country and community context? So I wanted to share that as the last element, because I feel that is really the spirit behind what the Secretariat hopes to do when we receive these funding requests, is not to look at it in a format of, does it fit this space? Is this an adaptation or is it not adaptation? Is it disaster risk management? Is it not? Is it humanitarian? Is it not? Perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps that's not the task, is to have a very clearly laid out top-down structure. Perhaps the task is to say, this is what the country needs, this is what they are experiencing. They have the ability to be resilient themselves. Communities just need the support. So this is something that I hope to see coming through our funding requests. Of course, it will be oversubscribed. 250 million is not going to solve our problem, but perhaps it will show the concept. it will show that perhaps this will work, and based on which we hope to build our long-term modalities, of course, with our board as well. So I'll stop here, and I know there'll be lots of questions, but yeah, thank you very much for letting us intervene.
Thank you, Jay. In fact, I would want to ask you hundreds of questions around that, but it's really encouraging to see that, and I'm also happy that you mentioned those opening statements, because a lot of us fought really, really hard to see FRLD in the shape it is today. But the fact that you are not going to repeat the same issues and challenges and the barriers to access that couple of other funds had, I'm not going to mention them, and you are open to not being very rigid about those definitions around loss and damage and about resilience, about adaptation. In fact, it infuriates me. I am from a think tank, and somebody starts telling me, oh, what's the difference between displacement, refugee, and migrant? I said, people have left their homes. Is that not sufficient? Why do you try to put them in particular bracket, or capital L, capital D, small l, small d? That it really belittles the kind of impact that communities are facing on the ground. But also the fact that loss and damage also occurs because adaptation is not optimally implemented, because they don't have funds to implement adaptation, and that's why loss and damage happens. I am going to turn to our last panelist, and there's a reason why I kept Emiliano last, is because he basically, like, there was a method behind this madness, I would say. Like, we brought together different perspectives on this panel. And why Emiliano here? Because he's doing something. Of course, I know Brazil is a developing country, and probably they can find, we are doing this work hoping that the government might fund it and other private sector might come in together, and that's also a prototype that we need to develop around loss and damage funding. Emiliano is from an organizer, director of Instituto Fome Zero. They are supporting the government in Brazil to see how they can use the existing social protection programs to design insurance pre-payout mechanism when a disaster strikes a community. And here they are looking not just at immediate relief, like, of course that's needed, cash transfer, food aid, all that is needed, because Bolsa Familia is one of the world's largest social protection program, but to also see how they can work with the farmers to build longer term resilience. So Emiliano, over to you.
Thank you, Ritu. Thank you all for this very nice panel. Instituto Fome Zero was created from the conviction and the past experiences that ending hunger and building resilience must be locally, in the territories, and connecting people knowledge to the national and global policies. In Brazil and also in Latin America, communities have always been the real innovators for resilience for us. Not passive recipients of assistance, but active architects of protection and food systems that preserve dignity and livelihoods. We have a say here in Brazil. It's the triple A. It's water, agua, shelter, abrigo, and food, alimento. So this is I see the key element for our policies. The evidence is clear. When social protection is connected to community infrastructure, such as water harvesting, food storage, and school kitchens, every dollar invested can save up to $5 avoided losses. There are two very good examples nowadays in Brazil. In the semi-arid in the northeast of Brazil, women's cooperatives are using early warning system tied to local grain banks and solar-powered systems. When drought alerts are triggered, cash transfers and food stocks are automatically released for them. In the Amazonian municipalities, the indigenous and riverine communities are operating floating gardens, solar cold chain hubs, and community boats to guarantee their access to the fresh food when the flood comes. These are good examples of anticipatory resilience in practice. Locally managed, inclusive systems that merge climate intelligence, social protection, and local infrastructure. They remind us that resilience is not only about finance or technology, it's also about governance, trust, and local participation. Using the Aspire tool and looking for the best examples, 4 lessons emerge. Early warning triggers must link meteorological and social data. Delivery systems must be flexible, and community-based assets should be built into every program. And the fourth, the multi-source finance, combining national budgets, climate funds, and local contributions is crucial for the long-term sustainability. When these elements converge, the social protection becomes a platform for transformation, protecting lives while enabling productivity and inclusive development. Loss and damage are not only about infrastructure destroyed, they destroy about harvests. The nutrition is compromised and the livelihoods are eroded. Linking social protection with food systems turns into the central pillar of the global loss and damage response. Our Zero Hunger experience here in Brazil shows that cash transfers, local food procurement, and participatory governance can work together. In these systems, incorporate anticipatory triggers and the resilience finance. They can function as the first line of defense, reaching people before the crisis escalates. Yet, less than 10% of the adaptation finance currently reaches out to local actors. This is a structural imbalance that must be changed. We advocate for the direct access mechanisms so that municipalities, cooperatives, and community networks can access small grants and blended finance for resilience and food security plans. Blended finance that combines national social protection budgets, climate funds, and private impact investments can also make these solutions more durable and replicable. The governance remains the foundation for the success, and this is an important remark. I think nobody knows Hunger People Association. There is no such an organization like this, any grassroots of hunger people. So we need the governance, the local governance with these afflicted people. The original Fome Zero Hunger model here in Brazil worked because it built a participatory system, the local food and nutrition councils, with citizens, partnerships across governments, academia, and the civil society organized. The same principles should guide locally led adaptations today, integrating the social protection, agriculture, environment, and disaster management under shared accountability that ensures governance. Community must remain the decision makers, not the beneficiaries only, with transparency built into every stage, from the design to the delivery. We also share with Rito, and we propose this contributing a joint learn platform to document the best practices and inform the future proposals of any kind of fund for manage the disasters to support this good practice replication. The message from the communities is simple. The resilience begins before anything. The anticipatory social protection and the local food systems are two sides of the same coin for us. One protects income and dignity, and the other sustains the nutrition and the livelihoods. Together they can turn loss and damage from an inevitable cost into a preventive challenge. And we can share this with you anytime, so thank you.
Thank you. In fact, Emiliano is working with us on something called Aspire Roadmap. This is what we are doing with 8 other countries, which are mostly least developed countries and small island developing states. But we are now expanding it to countries like Brazil, Mali, Somalia, because we want to come out with different prototypes of how loss and damage funding can be done. We, of course, FRLD funds from there can become catalytic. But we're also looking for philanthropy money. We are also looking to tap into private sector money. We're looking to tap into insurance sector money. And unless we create different prototypes and models, we'll never be able to meet all that funding requirements that's required for loss and damage. So I'm really thankful to all our panelists. All of you brought in such great perspective. And even though we may not have the best of participants here, but we are hoping that we have recorded this and we'll put it out with your permission online so that it then influences the thinking, because the kind of perspective that all of you have brought, it's different category of issues that need to be brought around the table to collectively address, even though we are talking about bottom-up, locally led, but we need different actors to come and support that locally led. And I believe we had that different kind of actors present on this panel today. So thank you so much for your perspective. I'll just take one final, I think we are already like 5 minutes beyond. I will request you for one final photo op, but yeah, Beam, go ahead.
Just one quick on the, what we have seen from the research, there's a strong gender implication on the loss and damage kind of side, yeah, because men and women are impacted differently. So that we have seen in Vanuatu, there's a lot of mental kind of, stress the women are going through. So there is a strong gender kind of lens of it that came out from our research, and I wonder, how we really go about even loss and damage fund, like, how we're going to take care of the gender issue, which we have seen quite clearly actually, because women are more affected than the men, either like in terms of mental health or like in Vanuatu, there was a special plant, they made the handicrafts by women. So anyway, so that's something I think we have seen that came out very strongly in our research, and something I think for us to discuss.
I know. So Beam, I think we are already through with our time. But if you allow, I think all of us needs to give a round of applause to all our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us and for your incredible inputs and insights.